Late at night, a seductive woman was taking a stroll alone. The man on the balcony became enchanted by her. When the woman asked if she could come to his place to rest for a while, the man excitedly agreed. However, he had no idea that this woman was not human. From that point on, the villagers of the village started dying under mysterious circumstances. The story occurred 2 months ago, involving a girl in the village, the graceful young girl with her elegant figure. During the day, she strolls along the country paths. But at night, she meets a tragic death in the forest. Her name is Shimizu, the village's recognized beauty. Her fashion and style are incredibly trendy, yet they attract the villagers' mockery. Shimizu considers them vulgar, believing she alone symbolizes nobility. She even thinks she's the only one who has any chance of getting out of this village and live a life of adulation. In this village she detests so much. She only cares about 2 things. One is the recently constructed mansion, for if she can get acquainted with its owner, she's certain to experience a life of luxury. Another thing is her crush, Koid, who moved from the city. Every day she stands by his window, but Koid barely shows any interest in her. Lately, the village has become eerie. Several elderly people have died in succession, including everyone, even the police, deeming them natural deaths. It's a mysterious village, surrounded by dense forests. The villagers make a living by selling coffins. This man, Osaki, is the local doctor. After conducting autopsies, he also concludes natural causes. This day, Shimizu once again arrives outside the mansion, fantasizing about being invited by its owner to live a life of extravagance and be his adopted daughter. At that moment, her best friend Kaori walks up from behind. She says the couple in the mansion already has a daughter, and rumors circulate among the villagers, claiming the residents inside aren't normal people. These words greatly displease Shimizu. She thought the villagers were spreading rumors out of jealousy. After saying her piece, she turns and walks away, determined to investigate the mansion's entrance. As she recalls the gossip the villagers once spread about her, she finds their vulgarity repulsive. Now, she senses a pair of invisible eyes watching her from the mansion, but this doesn't frighten her. She believes her beauty has caught the attention of the mansion's owner. In an attempt to showcase herself, she walks with a seductive model's gait, but accidentally stumbles and twists her ankle. At that moment, the mansion's gates open, and a man steps out. The scene shifts. It's now 9 o'clock in the evening. Kaori learns from her mother that Shimizu hasn't returned home. The village chief is also informed of this news, and immediately gathers the villagers to search the mountains. Soon, they discover a female corpse. It turns out to be Shimizu. Surprisingly, she is still alive when found. Shimizu's parents call for the village Dr. Osaki to conduct a comprehensive examination. In the end, the conclusion is a simple case of anemia, but Shimizu keeps complaining about feeling tired. The next morning, Osaki receives the news of Shimizu's death. Osaki suggests performing an autopsy to determine the true cause of death, but Shimizu's father refuses. Instead, he invites Muroi, the temple's abbot, to officiate the funeral. At the funeral, Koid, the object of Shimizu's affection, also attends. Kaori intends to give him the last love letter Shimizu wrote, but Koid rejects it, stating that he and Shimizu were not close, and promptly walks away. Soon, Shimizu's funeral comes to an end. Koid could finally open his window without hesitation, because Shimizu used to come and peep outside every day. But just then, he saw Shimizu's figure once again, making him think he must be seeing things. Shimizu had secretly admired Koid for a long time, and desperately hoped that he would notice her. The villagers often gossiped about their relationship, and even her best friend Kaori wanted to force herself to accept Shimizu's love letter after her death. Koid despised this feeling of being manipulated by others, and hated people talking about him behind his back. But now, Shimizu was dead, and no one would disturb his life anymore. Osaki took Shimizu's blood samples back to examine them, and found her anemia condition to be extremely strange. It was as if her blood had been completely drained. The flow of blood within her body was unusually fast. However, there were no external injuries or signs of bleeding before Shimizu's death. This puzzled Osaki. Just when Osaki was at a loss, the nurse brought news that an elderly man from the coffin factory had passed away. This time, the situation was different from Shimizu's case. The old man was already of advanced age. It was normal for his body to struggle in the current hot weather. Even more surprising, In the afternoon, another old lady from the village died. She had been perfectly fine a few days ago, with no signs of any health issues. This was incredibly strange. In just 2 weeks, 8 people had died in the village. All of them had extreme anemia in common. Something was definitely wrong. Meanwhile, Koit sat by the window, doing his homework. Suddenly, he heard some movement in the bushes outside. He looked up and saw Shimizu, who he thought was dead. It turned out to be a nightmare. For a whole week, he hadn't had a good night's sleep. Even on his way to school, he could see Shimizu's figure on the bus. It was driving him to the brink of collapse. Determined to find some peace, he decided to stay overnight at his friend Muta's house. Koit thought he would finally get a good night's sleep. But when night fell, 2 pairs of eyes appeared outside the house in the dark. In the next moment, the living room door swung open, and Shimizu walked in. She then approached the staircase, step by step, getting closer and closer to Koit. However, he couldn't move at all, as if he were tied to the bed. Then the door opened. It was Muta's sister. It seemed he was having another nightmare. Koit breathed a sigh of relief. But in the next moment, Shimizu appeared under Muta's bed in a strange posture. She was dressed very sexy, continuously uttering Koit's name. Koit was petrified, unable to make a single movement. When Shimizu noticed Muta beside him, she expressed her anger and hated anyone who got close to Koit, and that only she could possess him. She then leaned over Mutu and revealed her red lips, exposing 2 sharp fangs. The next moment, Koit woke up abruptly. He looked towards Mutu, desperately trying to wake him up and ensure he was alive. Mutu opened his eyes, and there were no signs of any injuries on his neck. It seemed that everything that had just happened was indeed a dream. However, 2 days later, when Koit was about to visit Muta's house, he saw Osaki rushing towards the house in a hurry. He felt something was amiss and immediately followed him. It turned out that ever since that night Koit spent at Muta's house, Muta had fallen seriously ill. Koit cautiously entered the room, and learned the devastating news that Muta had passed away. At that moment, Koit suddenly realized that what he had seen that night might not have been a dream after all. He returned home, still immersed in grief over Muta's death. His mother walked in and handed him a letter. Koit opened it and was shocked to see that it was signed by Shimizu, who had been dead for half a month. He tore the letter into pieces and threw them out the window. It seemed that a plan was forming in his mind. The next morning, Koit stood outside his window. He looked at the torn letter on the floor. There were signs that it had been moved. The following day, Koit went to the village hospital and found Osaki. He wanted to confirm whether Shimizu was truly dead. Osaki assured him that she had no heartbeat and her body had already stiffened, leaving no room for doubt. Koit then asked about the possibility of resurrection. Osaki jokingly replied that only zombies or vampires could come back to life. Koit bid farewell and left, leaving Osaki standing there alone. Osaki began to recall all the patients he had treated recently. He realized that they all had the same anemia and 2 puncture wounds resembling needle marks. The number of deaths in the village was increasing, and with the village's tradition of burial, a dreadful thought crossed Osaki's mind. Perhaps the deceased weren't suffering from an illness after all. Meanwhile, Kaori and her brother Akira were observing the eerie castle. Akira excitedly claimed to have seen one of their deceased neighbor's brothers entering the castle. He thinks they must have something to do with all the deaths in the village. The siblings crouched in the bushes, keeping a close watch on the castle. At that moment, Koit arrived, startling the siblings. As they were returning, Akira shared his thoughts with Koit. He also revealed that he had seen the deceased Shimizu. Kaori added that Shimizu had mentioned seeing the lady of the castle before her death. Koit proposed a bold idea, to open Shimizu's grave. The 3 of them decided to go to the graveyard together in search of the truth. As they arrived at the graveyard, Kaori noticed a small box buried with Shimizu. Inside the box was an amulet. But why was it here? Without hesitation, they began digging, working through the night due to the burial being deep. Finally, they uncovered the coffin. It had cracks and appeared to have been opened with a strong force. Koit opened the coffin to find it empty. Shimizu had indeed come back to life. Just then, a pair of hands emerged from the trees, covering Kaori's mouth and abducting her. In this critical moment, Kaori took out the protective amulet. Koit arrived just in time and saved her. Koit reached out to touch the abductor, only to realize that the person had no breath or body temperature. It was clear that he had died long ago. Koit decided to place the man inside Shimizu's coffin. The next day, they would inform the villagers and uncover the truth together. They dragged the man into the grave and covered it up. Early the next morning, Koit arrived at the graveyard. To their astonishment, the graveyard had been restored to its original state, and there was no one inside. Meanwhile, another patient was brought to the hospital. Osaki decided to stay up all night to watch over her. If there really is a vampire, then he'll catch him and dissect him. He had to protect the village at all costs. To do so, Osaki found Miroi, the temple's abbot, to keep watch with him. At night, the patient suddenly said, "Here it is." Startled, the two rushed into the ward. They heard the sound of someone scratching the window with their nails. Osaki immediately pulled open the curtains. The two of them were stunned by the scene before their eyes. Then they realized that the person in front of them was none other than Nao, the daughter of the elderly woman lying on the hospital bed. However, she had been dead for 7 days. Just then, the elderly woman on the hospital bed shouted loudly, "I'm here!" At that moment, Nao, who had been discovered by them, gradually disappeared into the darkness of the night. Osaki suddenly realized that Nao wasn't a vampire, but rather a creature similar to a vampire, the legendary Shiki. Miraculously, the next day, the old woman's condition began to improve. Based on Nao's behavior of not daring to enter the room last night, Osaki deduced that Shiki cannot enter a house without being invited by the owner. During the daytime, they were unable to act. With this in mind, Osaki finally felt relieved and went to get some rest. This seemingly lifeless woman was none other than Nao, who had passed away 7 days ago. She was heading towards the hospital where her mother was located. Osaki and Miroi were standing outside her mother's hospital room. Suddenly, the hospital's power supply was cut off. Miroi hurried downstairs to find a generator. Nao took this opportunity to go outside the hospital and continuously called out for her mother. Osaki hurriedly approached, wanting to awaken the old woman, but it was futile. So, he turned his attention to Nao outside the window, but there was no one outside. Taking advantage of the opportunity, the old woman tried to sneak out of the hospital room. Miroi had just arrived on the first floor of the hospital when the door suddenly closed on its own. Immediately after, a shadow appeared behind him. It was Shimizu, who had died a month ago. Then more Shiki emerged behind Shimizu, each of them being villagers who had died in the past month. They approached with an aggressive demeanor, but they didn't attack him. It seemed they hadn't received an invitation from the hospital's owner, so they couldn't enter. Shimizu sneered contemptuously. It turned out that earlier in the morning, Osaki's foolish wife had invited them in. In the next moment, the hospital's power supply system was restored. Suddenly, a person appeared behind Osaki and knocked him down to the ground. Then the person picked up the old woman and leaped out of the window. Outside the hospital, Nao had been waiting for her mother. She excitedly embraced her mother, and the other Shiki gathered around. In no time, the old woman was sucked dry and turned into a lifeless corpse. At the same time, Koid and his two companions were observing the graves of other villagers, but what they didn't realize was, they were already being watched. That evening, someone came to Koid's house. Koid's father, Yuki, opened the door only to be confronted by a creepy doll. Behind the doll stood a little girl named Shizu, who had come to find Koid, but Koid wasn't home. But Shizu insisted on entering the house and waiting for Koid to return. Faced with her unreasonable behavior, Yuki just wanted to get rid of her quickly. Infuriated, Shizu threw the doll into the house. Yuki's wife heard the noise and rushed over. Seeing a little girl, she advised Yuki not to make a fuss over a child. Reluctantly, Yuki agreed to let her wait inside until Koid came back. However, as soon as Shizu entered the house, she asked if her brother could come in later. Helpless, Yuki agreed. Shizu then revealed a sinister smile. She then waited in Koid's room. Before long, Koid returned home. His parents quickly told him about the situation. However, Koid didn't recognize the girl at all. As he opened the door to his room, the little girl who had just been there suddenly disappeared. Koid realized that something was amiss and asked his parents what they had said to her. His mother mentioned that his brother would also be coming over later. Late at night, Koid sat on his bed, holding a wrench, looking tense. It seemed he was waiting for something. At midnight, the clock struck, and suddenly, there was a knocking sound on the window. He reached for his crucifix, staring intently at the dark figure outside. The figure pressed against the window, attempting to force it open. Fortunately, Koid had locked it in advance. Both sides stared at each other through the window, the tension reaching its peak. It felt as if the next second the figure would break in through the window. Then, unexpectedly, the figure called out Koid's name. Koid was startled because the voice belonged to Mutu, who had recently died. Overwhelmed by resurfacing memories, Koid lost control of his hands and unlocked the window. But outside, there was no one to be seen. Just then, his hand was grabbed by someone. Koid resisted with all his strength and, in that moment, he saw the face of the person holding him. It was Mutu, but as soon as Koid recognized him, Mutu suddenly escaped. Koid hurriedly chased after him. He chased him all the way to the old spring in the village. Memories of the past came flooding back. His own terrible personality, with only Mutu willing to be friends with him. But why did those monsters have to kill such a kind-hearted person like Mutu? He could never forgive them. However, at that moment, a figure emerged from behind Koid. He claimed to be the leader of the Shiki named Tatsumi. Tatsumi was the one who had given the order to Mutu to kill Koid earlier. Although Mutu didn't want to harm his best friend, he couldn't refuse Tatsumi's command. Tatsumi stated that Koid was the first person in the village to realize their existence and he was planning to silence him. Koid was about to flee, but unexpectedly, Shimizu suddenly emerged from the bushes. Koid prepared himself for a desperate fight, but just then, Mutu jumped out from behind him. Mutu revealed his fangs and aimed for Koid's neck. Since then, Koid has been paralyzed, bedridden, because Mutu hypnotized him. As a result, Koid couldn't reveal the truth to anyone. Looking at Koid's frail condition, his father, Yuki, became concerned. Considering the strange illness that had been afflicting the village recently, he worriedly asked his wife if they should take him to the hospital. However, Koid's mother dismissed it as a common cold and believed he would recover after a good night's sleep. In the afternoon of that day, Kaori and Akira came to visit Koid, and filled the room with talismans from a bag they brought. When Yuki discovered it, he became furious. As an atheist, he strongly opposed such superstitious practices and promptly removed all the talismans. That night, Mutu returned as expected, tears streaming down his face. He bared his fangs and attacked Koid once again. The next day, when Yuki woke up complaining that his wife hadn't prepared breakfast for him, he noticed a note left on the dining table. His wife couldn't accept Koid's death and decided to leave the gloomy village. In a hurry, Yuki opened Koid's room, only to find a lifeless body. From 2 months ago, the number of deaths in the village had been gradually increasing, with most of the deceased turning into Shiki. They retained all their memories from when they were alive and had the same abilities as normal humans. The only difference was their need to feed on blood and their limited activity to nighttime. Due to the relatively small number of Shiki at the moment, their actions were highly organized and secretive, but they were discovered by 3 high school students. Now, they had turned their attention to Kaori and Akira. The leader dispatched Shimizu to handle the task. As she used to be Kaori's best friend, utilizing her beauty, Shimizu managed to control their father. She then approached their house from outside the window. Coincidentally, she overheard their conversation inside the house about how Shiki could only enter a home if invited. Shimizu felt they were too naive and decided to target their parents instead. Meanwhile, Tanaka, who had returned home, sat silently at the dining table. His wife complained whether he had been drinking too much. Noticing a doctor's business card beside him, she concluded that Tanaka had gone to see the doctor after drinking. Angrily, she left the room. Outside, Shimizu was happily spinning around. In the late night, Kaori was startled awake by noises coming from outside the window. It was Shimizu's voice, repeatedly saying that their father was already dead. Upon hearing her sister's desperate plea for help, Akira rushed over. Together, they anxiously went downstairs and opened their parents' bedroom, only to find their father missing. They began searching separately, and finally, in the hallway, they found their father unconscious. However, their mother believed it was just the result of excessive drinking. She picked up the doctor's business card and dialed the number on it, but to her surprise, as soon as she mentioned her husband's name, the person on the other end seemed to know everything and claimed to be on their way. Before she could even hang up the phone, someone was already knocking at the door. The visitor identified themselves as the doctor they had just spoken to and asked if they could come in. And so, Kaori's family fell into an unexpected tragedy. Legend has it that if someone dies an unjust death, they will resurrect on the 5th day with lingering resentment. Their companions will dig them out of their graves, and the village elders call them Shiki. Surprisingly, the first person to notice the existence of the Shiki was a woman named Takumi. As early as 2 months ago, she learned from stargazing that the village was about to face a crisis, and the Kurashiki family, who had recently moved in, were the source of it all. However, when she informed the villagers about this, they dismissed her as crazy. Until 2 months later, the villagers began to die one by one. She wanted to save everyone, but no one believed her. Ikumi went to the place where the villagers often gathered and shouted loudly, informing them that the village was in grave danger. If they didn't drive out the Kurashiki family, the village would be destroyed. Ikumi gathered a group of villagers from the village and confronted Dr. Osaki. They asked him why he had been concealing the true cause of death for the patients. Osaki explained that his medical skills were not advanced enough to save those patients. However, in reality, Osaki had witnessed the Shiki killing people firsthand, but because he didn't know the real way to kill Shiki and was afraid of Shiki retaliating against the villagers, that's why he used this excuse to deceive them. Ikumi was disappointed with the doctor's response and decided to lead everyone to the Kurashiki house to uncover the truth. When they arrived at the castle gate, Ikumi angrily pounded on the iron door, and it slowly opened. Saishiro Kurashiki, the head of the Kurashiki family, appeared in the sunlight. Ikumi was incredulous because Shiki couldn't be exposed to sunlight. However, Ikumi didn't give up and immediately placed Ofuda, talisman paper, on Saishiro, but it had no effect. Only Osaki, who had arrived, knew that there were mutated Shiki who weren't afraid of sunlight. To gather more information, Osaki proposed to take Saishiro's pulse. Surprisingly, Saishiro willingly extended his hand. After examining his pulse, Osaki discovered that Saishiro's physical condition was exactly the same as a normal person's. He shared this result with the villagers, and they dispersed. However, Shiki shouldn't have a pulse. What could be the explanation behind this? When Ikumi returned home at night, the villagers mocked her as a lunatic. She screamed hysterically, and suddenly, she heard a woman's cry for help from outside. The woman said her family was being attacked by Shiki and regretted not listening to Ikumi's words. She begged Ikumi to come and save them. Ikumi also wanted to capture a Shiki to prove herself to the villagers. However, she forgot the most important thing. At noon that day, when Osaki returned to the hospital, he found his wife, Kyoko, lying on the couch, gasping heavily, with bite marks on her neck. He knew that those creatures had come. Despite his desperate efforts to save her, Kyoko couldn't make it through that night. But when the nurse asked about Kyoko's condition the next day, Osaki claimed that she had recovered from her illness. Afterwards, Osaki placed numerous ice packs around Kyoko's body. He stared at his wife's lifeless form, a bold idea forming in his mind. If the villagers could die and come back as blood-sucking monsters, then Kyoko might also resurrect. He decided to personally document this process and find a way to deal with those creatures. However, after 5 days of sleepless vigilance, Kyoko showed no signs of resurrection, and Osaki's physical and mental strength had reached their limits. If she doesn't come back to life by tomorrow morning, he would have to give up. Just then, the EEG machine emitted a sound, and the screen started flickering. Osaki understood that Kyoko's resurrection was beginning. Kyoko's stiff body began to soften, the livor mortis disappeared completely, her skin regained its luster, and her eyes showed signs of pupil reflex. Apart from lacking body temperature, Kyoko appeared no different from an ordinary person. The next morning, when Osaki pulled back the curtains and the sunlight fell on Kyoko's face, her skin started rapidly deteriorating. Osaki quickly transferred her to the underground operating room, where her decaying skin began to regenerate rapidly. In order to find Shiki's weakness, Osaki decided to dissect Kyoko. However, to his surprise, Kyoko woke up. Osaki gagged her mouth and started experimenting with drug injections, but it had no effect. However, she clearly showed signs of fear upon hearing the crisp sound of metal colliding. Especially when faced with sacred objects like Buddhist statues, her reaction intensified. Osaki used a surgical knife to cut her skin, but the wound quickly healed. Even when he inserted a needle into her brain, there was no substantial damage. Finally, he contemplated destroying her heart. After hesitating for a moment, he finally made a decision. Osaki, realizing that he had found a way to kill the Shiki, now only needed to inform the villagers about the existence of the Shiki. He sought the help of his best friend, Muroi. However, when Muroi saw the horrifying scene in the operating room, he considered Osaki's actions to be extremely cruel. This caused a rift between the two best friends, and Muroi chose to join the ranks of the Shiki. With no other choice, Osaki took the evidence and went to the village council for help. To his surprise, the office building was empty, and the staff informed him that they had changed their working hours to the night. During the night, Osaki visited the office again and questioned the staff there. He wanted to know the exact number of deaths in the village over the past 2 months. However, the response he received was that there hadn't been any recent deaths in the village. At that moment, Osaki noticed that everyone in the office was actually a Shiki. Despite the danger, the doctor declared that he would eventually expose these monsters. At that moment, the curtain was lifted, revealing a seductive and attractive woman. It was Chizuru Kurashiki. the mistress of the castle, she immediately ordered her subordinates to take away the evidence from Osaki, but she didn't want to kill him, because she was attracted to Osaki. Osaki knew his time was running out, and he realized that perhaps this village was destined for destruction. Just then, Koide, who had been dead for 10 days, appeared before him. Osaki recognized that Koide had turned into a Shiki. But he was not an ordinary Shiki, he was an advanced type of Shiki known as a werewolf. Koide uttered the words, "You are not alone," and then walked away. Could it be that he was a Shiki standing on the side of humans? Perhaps there was still hope for this village. Tsunako, a young girl from a wealthy family, had a happy life with her parents and sisters until one day, a strange man was brought to a gathering by her father's friend. Tsunako's fate took a complete turn from that moment on. A few days later, Tsunako woke up to find herself inside a pitch-black coffin. She screamed desperately until a passerby heard her and rescued her. But the next moment, Tsunako opened her fangs. Her family locked her in a warehouse in a remote town, where she would receive food every night. But now, she had no appetite for human food and instead bit the maid who brought her meals. From then on, her parents would send a different maid every day, continuing to express their love for Tsunako in this twisted manner. Gradually, Tsunako learned a lot from the books in the warehouse and realized that she had become a Shiki. One day, after attacking the last maid, she escaped from the warehouse, hoping to return home, but when she arrived at the door of her house, she found that her family had already moved out. Heartbroken, Tsunako decided to search for them. She searched tirelessly from the 1860s until now. She finally realized that her family was no longer alive. At that moment, Tsunako had an intense desire for a home. Since no one would provide it for her, she decided to create it herself. She killed many people and resurrected Tatsumi as her servant. She also found 2 highly loyal individuals to act as her surrogate parents. However, her ambitions grew, and she wanted to establish a kingdom ruled by the Shiki, so she set her sights on this isolated village. Tsunako secretly gathered her followers, replaced the village council, and cut off all contact between the village and the outside world. Some villagers, enticed by the promise of immortality, desired to become Shiki. That night, the Shiki launched an attack on the hospital staff. When Osaki arrived, it was too late. When Osaki returned to the office, Shizuru had been waiting for a while. He intended to pierce her heart with a wooden stake, but Saishiru, who was lying in ambush outside, shattered the stake with a gunshot. Osaki was left with no options. He had to let Shizuru control him. Surprisingly, Shizuru took a keen interest in him. Shiki's method of controlling people is simple. As soon as the first bite is taken, the person will be controlled. After being bitten by Shizuru, Osaki pretended to be under her control, because he had allowed Koide, who had turned into a werewolf, to bite him before. That day, the village festival began. Shizuru wanted to go and see. However, she was afraid of the Buddhist statues at the festival. Osaki suggested that he would accompany her, turning it into a date. Shizuru was delighted by the idea, and she agreed. Little did she know that it was Osaki's trap. They walked openly on the streets. Osaki introduced her to the villagers, and she acted like she was above them all. As soon as they arrived at the festival, she was terrified. Just as she was about to retreat, Osaki held her hand and comforted her, urging her to continue. Shizuru forcefully pushed him away, and that's when the bite marks on Osaki's arm became visible. Shizuru realized that Osaki had not been under her control all along. Panicking, she attempted to escape, but a villager grabbed her hair. Then he touched her neck. As expected, there was no pulse. Another villager checked for a heartbeat, but there was none. The villagers gathered around, and Shizuru was knocked to the ground. According to Osaki's instructions, Shiki could only be killed by impaling their hearts with a stake. Tomio pinned Shizuru down, and another man picked up a hammer, forcefully driving it into Chizuru's heart. The villagers successfully killed the first Shiki. Afterward, Osaki shared all the information he had with the villagers, hoping they would unite and embark on a hunt to exterminate the Shiki. This is how the human counterattack against the Shiki began, with the villagers forming numerous teams. Tomio, the strongest man in the village, took the lead. He saw his recently deceased son turn into a Shiki. He didn't hesitate. He immediately pierced his son's heart with a wooden stake. The villagers dragged out the Shiki who had been hiding in cabinets. As soon as they were exposed to sunlight, their skin rapidly swelled and decayed, filling the air with a putrid smell. The day was coming to an end, and the defeated Shiki were thrown into a large pit in the square. However, Osaki looked at the number of Shiki in the pit and felt that it wasn't enough. He believed they must have hiding places that hadn't been discovered yet. Tomio, on the other hand, claimed that every corner of the village had been searched. Osaki suddenly realized that the village had constructed numerous underground waterways for irrigation purposes. These waterways were currently unused. The Shiki must be hiding inside them, but with the sunset approaching, Tomio suggested they rest for the night and resume their search in the morning. Just then, a villager slowly approached. In the next moment, he pulled out a gun and started shooting at the crowd. Tomio swiftly knocked him down with a punch, and the villagers rushed to restrain him. However, the man still had a pulse and was breathing. Looks like he's just been bitten by a Shiki. With proper treatment, he could have been saved. But Tomio, consumed by rage, mercilessly drove a stake into his heart. Soon after, the villagers reached the sewer system and quickly found the Shiki's hiding place. The Shiki struggled desperately but couldn't escape their fate of having their hearts impaled. Some were even bound by their feet and dragged out. The villagers got more and more excited. They even sang a song. The Shiki's limbs were tied, and some were bound to trees. As soon as the sun rose, their skin began to rapidly swell and decay. Each Shiki screamed, desperately trying to break free, but the stench in the air grew stronger, and each Shiki tasted the wretchedness of a fate worse than death. Another truck arrived, carrying a load of goods. This was the 99th truck of the day. The women skillfully unloaded the cargo, casually piling it together on the square. Nowhere left for the Shiki to escape. Almost all of them had been dealt with. The village was filled with the stench of blood. At that moment, 2 more people were dragged in by the villagers. One of them was the nurse who worked under Osaki. What the villagers didn't know was that until her heart was impaled by a stake, she had never harmed anyone. Looking at the brutal scene in front of them, one of the villagers finally threw up. He questioned if they were being too cruel, suggesting that they should end the hunting plan at this point. However, Osaki disagreed. At least now the Shiki leader and the Kurashiki family have not appeared. If they weren't eliminated, all the other villagers would become Shiki. The villagers gathered once again at the castle gate. At that moment, the steward Tatsumi realized they might have been discovered, so he instructed Muroi to quickly escape with Sanako. To cover Muroi's escape with Sanako, Tatsumi drove out of the castle first. The villagers swarmed in pursuit. Meanwhile, Muroi led Sanako to escape through the woods. Just as they reached the main road, they encountered Tomio and his group in a car. In that fleeting moment of their encounter, Osaki clearly saw Muroi's face. Tomio's car flipped into the field, and he and his men caught up with them. Muroi came to the temple, dragging a box and placing it beneath a statue of Buddha. He hid himself in a secret compartment. Tomio and his group arrived but couldn't find Muroi, so they resorted to threatening his parents. This led to a violent clash between the two sides. Muroi listened to his parents' screams of agony, but in the end, he never came out. On the other side, Shimizu was desperately trying to evade the pursuit of the villagers. She took a risk and crossed the highway, but she was quickly discovered. With no other option, she jumped into a nearby field. However, within seconds, the villagers caught up with her. She had no choice but to keep running. Despite her fear, suddenly, a tractor appeared, knocking her to the ground. She begged the villagers bitterly. In an instant, she was struck down again. She struggled to stand up, beginning to vent about this detestable village. She hated the villagers' mockery of her. Before she could finish speaking, she was once again knocked to the ground by the tractor. Meanwhile, Koide was confronting Tatsumi, but Tatsumi had no intention of engaging with him. His priority was protecting his master, who was in danger. However, Koide refused to let Tatsumi go. Despite both being werewolves, Koide had never consumed human blood, rendering him weaker in combat compared to Tatsumi. It didn't take long for Tatsumi to overpower Koide. Knocking him down, Tatsumi taunted him, claiming that even if he helped humans, he would never be accepted. Koide struggled to stand and, without hesitation, embraced Tatsumi and jumped off a cliff. They fell into the pit where the villagers buried Shiki. However, such harm was inconsequential to Tatsumi, but the next moment Koide took out explosives from his pocket and ignited it without hesitation. On the other side, Muroi took care of his parents' bodies and set off again with Sanako. Along the way, they encountered a villager. During their fight, he was injured, but the villager accidentally fell, and his head hit the ground. Muroi quickly took Sanako and hurried into the forest. However, due to his exertion, his wound reopened. At that moment, Tomio and his group followed the trail of blood and caught up with them. Muroi knew he couldn't escape anymore, so he hid the case under the slope. He went to distract them. By the time night falls, Sanako woke up, filled with fear. She could only run. Soon, she found Muroi lying unconscious on the ground. At that moment, Muroi's body was mutating, but Tomio and others caught up with them. Helpless, she had to abandon Muroi and continue fleeing. Tomio chased closely behind, which terrified Sanako. She stumbled and fell to the ground. When Sanako looked up, she saw a church. She entered and reflected on her life. She blamed God for treating her unjustly, regretting being resurrected in the first place. Just then, Tomio caught up with her. Sanako once again tried to escape, but Tomio threw a large hammer, striking her down. Then he grabbed her and pressed her against the wall, firmly grasping her neck. Tomio was filled with anger, because this young girl had caused chaos in the entire village. He picked up a wooden stake, preparing to impale her heart. Suddenly, blood gushed out, and the next moment, he fell heavily to the ground. It was Muroi, who had now transformed into a werewolf. Approaching Sanako slowly, he reached out and held her hand. By this time, the village had been engulfed in a raging fire. The city's fire brigade was rushing to extinguish the flames. A car approached, and inside sat Sanako and Muroi. The story ends here. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.